Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. I don't usually cover cases involving children. I know that for many people, it's something they simply can't stomach, especially parents and caregivers. And I obviously count myself in that group. I struggle deeply with covering children. This isn't a story I wanted to tell just for the sake of telling it. It involves an insidious type of crime I wanted to bring more attention to. Something unique to the deaths of babies and toddlers that we don't see in the deaths of older children or adults. It is inflicted by adults who should and do know better. For some, it is a brief moment of anger and frustration, and they may not realize how grievously they could injure a child. But others know what they are doing is vicious and wrong, that it is child abuse, but they still don't know it could end in death. The first time I remember hearing about this kind of abuse that led to the death of a child was in the late 90s when an American case went international. 30 years later, shaken baby syndrome cases are still often national news. Because despite how long the medical community has agreed about the syndrome, in courtrooms, expert opinions suddenly began changing. And in the media, it started to be considered controversial, which is unconscionable to many people. Parents and medical professionals alike do not see a gray area. They see a public health issue. It is child abuse that can lead to death. And calling it controversial is endangering children. Welcome to episode 215, The Death of Annie Burkett Shell. Today's case takes place in a suburb of Chattanooga, Tennessee, a neighborhood further away from the hustle and bustle of downtown, where kids play in front yards, neighbors stop to chat, and things are a little quieter. The morning of August 9th, 2018 was warm and overcast, with the threat of an afternoon thunderstorm predicted. Tiffany and David Shell would have had their hands full that morning in their usual bustling schedule. It was a school day, and the Shell household in the Chattanooga neighborhood of Hickson, just northeast of the city, was a hive of activity as several of the couple's school-aged children prepared to head out the door. David and Tiffany had plans themselves that day, including having lunch together. Around 8:30 a.m., 26-year-old Brandi Giannunzio arrived at the Shell house to collect the two youngest members of the household, 2-year-old Annie and her younger sister Peyton. Brandy would be babysitting the girls that day, at least until David and Tiffany finished up their lunch date. The Shells knew Brandy well as a family friend, and her job was babysitting children in her home. She was trustworthy, reliable, caring, and had been babysitting Annie and Peyton for around 5 months. Annie Elizabeth Burkett Shell came into the world on August 28, 2015. David and Tiffany were actually Annie's maternal grandparents and her legal guardians, always referring to the girls as their daughters. The late summer of 2018 was an exciting time for Annie and her parents. Her 3rd birthday was fast approaching, and as any parent can tell you, there is a dramatic shift in toddlers around that age. It feels like overnight your baby has become a preschooler. We've heard about the terrible twos for decades, but parents now joke about the age of 3, calling their spunky little ones three-nagers. It seems like Annie, who was about 3 weeks away from turning 3, was still the sweet little ray of sunshine the Shells thought of as their baby. But of course, she had a definitive little upbeat personality already. They said she loved playing outside, learning gymnastics, and of course, the color pink. She was thriving. Their baby was growing up. That day, August 9th, Brandy drove the girls as usual the 10 to 15 minute drive back to her house in the Hamilton County community of Soddy Daisy. Like Hickson, Soddy Daisy is northeast of the downtown area, but it's just outside Chattanooga city limits. Its unusual name comes from the merging of the two communities of Soddy and Daisy back in 1969 and is today home to a little under 14,000 people. The morning passed quietly enough, but at around 12:15 p.m., a call came in to 911 from Brandy's home on Vine Street. The desperate babysitter reported that something was terribly wrong with Annie. The toddler was experiencing some sort of seizure, and Brandy had no idea what was causing it. Brandy then called David Shell, telling him Annie had a seizure, fell over, and hit her head. They agreed that Brandy would ride in the back of the ambulance with Annie, and David and Tiffany would meet them at Erlanger Hospital. As hospital staff ruled out neurological conditions in the following hours and days, they told David and Tiffany that the seizures Annie was experiencing were not brought on by natural causes. The toddler had sustained blunt force trauma to her head. She had a visible bruise on her face. Whether it was accidental or intentionally inflicted was difficult to tell at that point. Sadly, further scans eventually showed Annie was unlikely to recover any brain function. There was also bruising at the front of Annie's heart and a 2-centimeter split in her esophagus. On August 21st, 12 days after Annie was rushed to the hospital, and just a week shy of her 3rd birthday, she passed away. There had been no hope that she would recover. Annie's life support was withdrawn at the decision of David and Tiffany, and the little girl died, surrounded by her shattered family. Annie's autopsy showed she died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head and chest, causing internal bruising and bleeding. The medical examiner found bleeding around her spinal cord cavity and in the surrounding tissue, as well as bleeding around her optic nerves, behind her eyes. The manner of death was homicide, with a blood clot on her brain, indicating that her injuries were sustained very suddenly around the time that she was in Brandy's care. Annie's devastated family still didn't understand what could have happened to cause such serious head injuries. Just the night before the incident, Annie had been running around at home, laughing and playing happily. She showed no sign of illness or distress. How could this buoyant little girl suddenly be on the verge of death less than 24 hours later? From the day Annie was rushed to the hospital, the wheels had started turning behind the scenes. Hospital staff notified the Soddy Daisy Police Department that they had grave concerns about the nature of Annie's injuries and what exactly had occurred in the hours and minutes leading up to Brandy's 911 call. And of course, Annie's sister Peyton had also been in Brandy's care that day. Because of the suspicions that Annie had been a victim of child abuse, Peyton was also examined. She had dried blood around her nostrils and swelling and bruises around her nose. Her parents told local news Channel 3 that she had gotten some bumps and bruises, but no charges were ever brought about Peyton's injuries. Investigators learned that when paramedics first arrived at Brandy's home, her boyfriend was also there, 27-year-old Benjamin Spencer Brown. Ben and Brandy had a baby girl together, and he would later testify that he lived with Brandy and his daughter. But the Shells didn't know that. David and Tiffany didn't know Ben was at Brandy's house that morning. In fact, they had never even met the man. It was only after Annie was taken to the hospital that the Shells first heard about any other adult being present while Brandy was caring for their children. Lieutenant Jake Elrod interviewed Brandy and Ben. Brandy said she was home all morning and saw Annie have a seizure in the bathroom before falling and hitting her head. Ben supported Brandy's story, saying he didn't know what had caused the mark on Annie's face. Lieutenant Elrod had a niggling feeling about the couple's accounts. something didn't feel right. But without something more substantial to go on, Elrod wouldn't even be able to get a search warrant for Brandy's home. But the investigator felt like Benjamin Brown wasn't the kind of guy anyone would necessarily want around their kids. And if the Shells had known about his history, they wouldn't have allowed their children to stay at Brandy's house if Ben was there. And he wasn't wrong about that feeling. Brown did have quite a history. He had been smoking marijuana daily since he was 12 years old. After leaving school in the 9th grade, Ben had worked as a roofer. He also had a prior record for 2 charges of theft, violating parole, failure to appear in court, and the most concerning, 2 assault charges. In 2015, Benjamin Brown viciously assaulted his 65-year-old father-in-law and former boss, Claude Stamey, on Mr. Stamey's front porch. Ben attacked his father-in-law because he used to work for Mr. Stamey, but he had fired Ben when he caught him stealing. He beat the older man, who was recovering from open heart surgery, with a metal statue, and then pulled a knife on him before police arrived. Brown pled guilty in 2015 to a lesser charge of simple assault. Claude would get another chance to testify about his son-in-law because of Annie's case. At the time of Annie's death, Benjamin was in the process of divorcing his wife of several years and mother of their young child. So he had 2 very young children of his own. Brandy's cell phone records revealed just after midday on August 9th, there was a number of incoming and outgoing calls, including her call to David Shell, telling him about Annie's alleged seizure and accident. There were also unanswered calls from Benjamin, as well as text messages between the couple after Annie arrived at the hospital. Brandy texted her boyfriend, "She fell in the bathroom and hit her head," to which Ben responded, "Okay." Brandy's later text messages to Ben from the hospital revealed she knew they were under suspicion early on. One text said, "Cops got called," with another reading, "CPS, they think I beat her, the hospital does." Ben replied, wanting to know if the Shells or he and Brandy were being investigated. Brandy didn't answer this question, instead just replying that she didn't want to babysit anymore. She did text several other people that day. One was a friend, and she also texted former employers. It became clear to law enforcement that Brandy had lied from the beginning about the extent of Ben's involvement. Why else would she text him from the hospital hours later to tell him what had happened if they had both been at home at the time? Investigators then learned that on the morning in question, Brandy had visited a local hair salon that was just a 2-minute drive from her house. When they contacted the business to verify her visit and examine videotape from the salon's security camera, they saw that just after 9 a.m., on the day Brandy picked up Annie and Peyton, she entered the salon, but she was alone. Brandy didn't leave until 2.5 hours later, when she came out and sat in her car at 11:30. After a few minutes, she went back inside. She came back out at noon and appeared to be in a real rush to get in her car and leave. Where were the little girls she was supposed to be caring for? It was obvious now that Brandy wasn't at home at all when Annie sustained her injuries. One of the first responders had already told police that something seemed off when they arrived at the home, as in Brandy and Ben's accounts of what happened to Annie. Like they were trying to get their stories straight. Funeral services for Annie Elizabeth Burkett Shell were held on the afternoon of August 25, 2018, at Williamson & Sons Funeral Home in Soddy Daisy. Visitation for family and friends was held the night before. She was laid to rest at Hamilton Memorial Gardens in Hickson, Tennessee, following her funeral service. 3 days after her funeral, her family released balloons on what would have been Annie's 3rd birthday. On September 26th, Benjamin Brown and Brandi Giannunzio were arrested and soon after indicted by a grand jury for their roles in Annie's death. Ben was charged with felony murder in the death of a child, in addition to aggravated child abuse, and released on a $150,000 bond. If convicted, he faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brandy was charged with making false reports, for lying to police and hospital staff, and 2 counts of being an accessory after the fact. She was released on a $51,000 bond. Police were still investigating, so they were limited in the amount of information they could pass on to the grieving family. So it was all terribly confusing to David and Tiffany, who grappled to understand what was going on and why Benjamin's bond was so low. The Shells had no specific details, let alone any clue as to a possible motive. In March 2019, David Shell reached out to the media, questioning Benjamin Brown's bond, following the news of a man accused of homicide and sitting in jail on a $2 million bond after allegedly killing his 4-week-old baby girl. I can't even imagine the anger David must have felt when he heard that other man's bond amount. Why would it be so different? Because he was the child's father? You would actually think that a stranger's bond might be higher. Domestic murders, be they spouses or children, are much more common. The nuances and possibility of accidents would be more understandable, if not forgivable. But when a stranger kills your little girl, and the bond is so low, I don't know how you could reconcile this. David had learned, though it wasn't public information at the time, about Ben's prior criminal history, which David felt should have been given more weight when the original bond amount was set. In Tennessee, bond amounts vary based on a number of reasons, including a suspect's tie to the community and the amount of evidence the police have, not just the accused person's prior criminal history. David later told WVTC that before Annie went with Brandy that morning, she was hollering out to him like she didn't want to go. David said, "I don't know if something had been happening before and she was just scared and she wasn't able to tell me." You can just imagine how his mind must have been spinning, thinking back, so afraid that he had missed some sign from Annie, that something was wrong in Brandy's house. Kids usually cry when they go to the sitters. It's hard for parents, but you get used to it, especially since most kids calm down so quickly after a parent is out of sight, as long as they feel safe. But David and Tiffany had never felt any reason to worry. At the accused couple's arraignment on October 5th, Benjamin Brown and Brandi Giannunzio pled not guilty. Outside the courtroom, after another hearing a week later, when the judge granted the couple 2 months to retain attorneys, Brandy made no comment. But Ben didn't shy away from the TV cameras. Before swaggering off, he told WTVC, "We didn't do nothing wrong to nobody. The little girl had a seizure, and that was it." Unfortunately, the couple's upcoming court appearances coincided with the global pandemic. COVID-19 caused massive court delays, and many cases were caught in the limbo of the huge system backlog. To the frustration of the Shells, Ben and Brandy's court dates kept getting pushed back. Annie's heartbroken family could do nothing but wait. But they made sure the public did not forget about their little girl, starting a Justice for Annie campaign on social media within 7 days after she was rushed to the hospital, before she passed away. Local businesses put Justice for Annie signs in their windows, and the Shells gave media interviews whenever they could. 30-year-old Benjamin Brown's trial finally began on February 9th, 2022, before Judge Barry Stillman. David and Tiffany Shell were there every day, praying and believing they would see justice done for Annie. According to the Chattanooga Times Free Press, the court was shown video taken from inside the Shell home in the days leading up to the assault. David testified he had installed a Google Nest camera as a way to monitor the kids to ensure they were safe. In the video, Annie played happily in the company of her family, corroborating David and Tiffany's accounts that the toddler was perfectly fine the night before she went to Brandy's. More video was shown, this time of Brandy arriving at the hair salon in Saudi Daisy, alone, around 9 a.m. the next day. Jurors also heard about the text messages between Brandy and Ben on the day Annie was injured. The timeline was damning. Brandy is seen coming out of the salon and sitting in her car at around 11:30. Then at 12 p.m., she is rushing out and is back at her home by 12:15 p.m. when she called 911. The prosecution called Hamilton County Chief Medical Examiner Dr. James Metcalf to the stand. He testified that the seriousness of Annie's injuries suggested she had received repeated blows in the form of being violently shaken, causing something most commonly referred to as shaken baby syndrome, but also recently known as shaken impact syndrome or abusive head trauma. But Dr. Metcalf also said Annie's injuries could have been caused by someone shaking her and punching her. According to the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, shaken baby syndrome, as the most common name implies, is a serious form of child abuse, as well as a major public health issue. It is usually inflicted by an angry or frustrated parent or caregiver, usually male, usually when a child exhibits prolonged bouts of inconsolable crying. The victim, who is typically between 2 and 4 months old, suffers a brain injury from bruising or bleeding, which can result in serious, permanent harm, disability, and sometimes death. This is due to violent shaking, not the type of movement caused by going over a bump in the car, bouncing your child on your knee, or even in a fall. During deliberate shaking, the baby or the child's head moves back and forth, similar to extreme whiplash, causing her brain to move around and impact against her skull. The scenario or explanation I just gave is for a baby much younger than Annie, but it's not like it never happens to children her age. While statistically, infants are more likely to be the victims of this kind of abuse, according to the CDC, children up to 5 have also been victims. Though exact statistics are difficult to gather, it's found to be the leading cause of child death resulting from abuse in the U.S. There are up to 1,300 deaths a year attributed to SBS. Infants and toddlers who have been shaken exhibit a range of symptoms presenting anywhere from between immediately to within hours, including drowsiness, vomiting, seizures, unconsciousness, breathing problems, pallor to the skin, and cardiac arrest. More recently, mostly in legal terms, there is what is called a triad of internal symptoms that pediatricians and emergency physicians are educated to look for: subdural and retinal hemorrhages and brain swelling. Annie had all 3 of these symptoms. She also had a bruise on her chest. Think of how you hold a baby or child up, where your hands would be, your thumbs at the center of her chest. If she was gripped hard enough, maybe that's what could have caused the bruise, rather than being struck. If you have ever watched a video demonstration of this kind of shaking, it is sickening. But the majority of people who do it are not strangers to the child. Parents and caregivers who inflict this sort of abuse are likely to have a history of family violence and/or substance abuse, which definitely describes Benjamin Brown. Environmental stressors, like social and financial factors, also increase the risk of abusive head trauma. It's unstable homes, feelings of isolation. But no matter how desperate things are, help is available, and this sort of abuse is entirely preventable. I mean, stating the obvious, parenting is hard, and no one should feel ashamed to reach out for help. But you can imagine the stigma a parent would feel about this kind of frustration and anger at a helpless baby. How do you admit that to someone? It's about losing control with a tiny human being who cannot help their behavior. It's not a punishment gone too far, but it's also not a deliberate murder. That's why it's such a complicated public health issue. But recently, judges have been ruling differently in appellate courts, citing a lack of cohesive opinions about SBS in the medical community as a whole. This past September, a New Jersey court called shaken baby syndrome junk science when they ruled in favor of a dual appellate case, combined for two fathers. There is a lot of controversy over these kind of rulings on both sides. And the sentences for offenders can be all over the place. There is a father on death row in Texas. A North Carolina father took an Alford plea and got a 5-year sentence. An article from Slate by an incarcerated journalist named John J. Lennon, who works with the Prison Letters Project for Yale Law, was published just last week about the controversy, citing the cases I just mentioned. Despite the problems Lennon was investigating, what dueling medical professionals as well as judges are recently finding, there was a review of 1,400 appellate rulings between 2008 and 2018. Only 3% of the cases were overturned. In understanding the controversy, it is mainly pediatricians and emergency physicians versus theoretical scientific opinion. I can understand how every case has different nuances, but I know personally I would rather trust the opinion of doctors who have actually treated children, not scientists conducting biomechanical tests. I always do last-minute research for any new sources on different issues before I record. And like I told you in my last episode, it often results in rabbit holes. It also happened in this case. I am old enough to remember the court case known as the nanny trial from 1997. A British au pair was convicted by a jury of second-degree murder in an SBS case, only for the trial judge to reduce her conviction to involuntary manslaughter and sentence her to time served. The case wasn't just big here, it made international headlines. The judge said he based his decision on his belief that the au pair injured the baby in a state of confusion, inexperience, frustration, immaturity, and some anger, but not malice. So as I am searching for more sources, I found a long-form article by Dr. Sanjay Gupta of CNN from 2 years ago. He was investigating another case where charges were actually dropped against a babysitter of a child who had been diagnosed with shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma. The defense took 9 different opinions of physicians who did not see the child and gave them to the medical examiner, who, it would seem under pressure, changed her opinion from homicide to undetermined, and the charges against the sitter were dropped. There was some discussion on how or why the defense was allowed to talk to the state's medical examiner instead of putting those 9 doctors on the stand at trial. The charges were just suddenly dropped, and that doctor had resigned from the state's ME office and changed her opinion after she was no longer working there, resulting in this baby and her parents being denied their day in court. Dr. Alice Newton, the child abuse pediatrician Dr. Gupta interviewed about this case, said these doctors the defense used are the kind of paid experts who testify to the same theories all over the country, regardless of whether their theory actually fits the medical evidence. Gupta cited what he called a cottage industry of paid experts. And though I have done research over the years about paid experts and often talk about the battle of experts in court, I did not know there was actually an online expert witness calculator you could refer to. I can't believe I've never come across it. And it was eye-opening. But also, according to Gupta, 24 domestic and international medical organizations acknowledge abusive head trauma as an accepted diagnosis. In other words, shaken baby syndrome is real. And after a few high-profile reversals in these cases, a survey of specialists, including those from pediatric neurosurgery, pathology, radiology, critical care, and pediatrics, showed that the vast majority believed in the science behind abusive head trauma, or SBS. The American Academy of Pediatrics president, Dr. Lee Savio-Beers, told CNN, "There really is not a controversy in medicine about the existence of abusive head trauma. The science behind it is really quite clear." But still, an appellate judge actually ruled it as junk science, setting precedent for a syndrome first discovered in 1946, then coming into our vernacular in 1974, 50 years ago, by medical professionals, not judges, not criminalists. This is not a subjective science like hair and fiber analysis or handwriting analysis. This is evidence found from CT scans, MRIs, and autopsies. Pediatricians and ER doctors are trained to look for the signs, but they always first rule out possible neurological problems, just like Annie's doctor did. Doctors interviewed say they obviously want to find a natural cause of death, a reasonable explanation. None of them want to find abuse. It's absurd to think that. Gupta spoke with many doctors, a few who sounded more angry than you might expect about SBS becoming a controversy. They say it's only a controversy brought on by paid witnesses and overexposure in the media, and that it's very dangerous to small children. These paid experts are using rare blood disorders and other medical conditions which do not actually match the evidence in these cases to discredit decades and decades of legal precedent about shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma. I know it feels as though I've turned a corner here from Annie's case, but I want to explain why. In those cases that the incarcerated journalist cited, it was fathers who were imprisoned. But in the cases Dr. Gupta discussed, it was babysitters. In most of the high-profile cases, it is sitters or caregivers rather than parents, which I think is an important distinction that does relate to Annie's case. Although Annie's case was about babysitters and not parents, I do want to point out parental statistics as well as encourage parents to reach out for help. Talking to a trusted friend, family member, your doctor, or a parenting helpline is the first step in helping to manage the stress, exhaustion, and frustration of new parenthood. And the broader community plays an important role in raising awareness and providing support to new parents who are struggling. Friends, family, and coworkers of people caring for babies and toddlers can also help by taking the first step and checking in, as embarrassment and feelings of inadequacy can be a reason why parents do not seek help. That's something else that's so important to point out. Reach out to your friends and family who are new parents. Check in on them. Because of the shame of what can come with admitting being so frustrated with their own baby, they may not want to reach out to you. But as we know, Benjamin Brown was not Annie's parent or even her real caregiver. He should not have been alone with her that day. Annie's parents had never even met this man. I definitely wanted to present the statistics and to encourage the empathy and help that would prevent this type of abuse in many cases. But it's not just difficult to empathize with Brown. I found it just about impossible. In Annie's case, the prosecution argued she was shaken so hard it caused the blood clot on her brain. To show how Annie could have sustained her injuries, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Metcalf, used a life-size doll, demonstrating that severe and consistent motion which caused her injuries, not just a one-off impact like a fall. The emergency pediatrician, Dr. Mary Palmer, also testified. While she didn't agree with blunt force trauma to the chest, she stated Annie did sustain direct trauma from 2 blows, each to her head and stomach. And as the ER doctor was explaining, these were not just found at autopsy. There was visible bruising on Annie's face and torso as she lay in the hospital. The prosecutor held up a photo of Annie's face in court to make that point. Whether she was shaken or struck, Benjamin Brown was violent enough with a toddler to kill her. I do doubt that he meant to kill her, but it doesn't mean he didn't realize that he was hurting her, which is an important distinction. The defense put a few doctors on the witness stand to refute the ME's and the ER doctors' opinions. Just like in those other national cases of caregivers on trial, the defense put on an array of paid witnesses offering alternative theories. But their ace in the hole was famed former New York City Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Michael Baden. I'm sure you've heard of him. He has testified in several high-profile trials, including those of Jeffrey Epstein, Derek Chauvin, Phil Spector, and O.J. Simpson. And you probably know that Dr. Baden is controversial in several aspects of his career, but he himself has said his reputation never recovered after testifying for O.J. Simpson's defense. He disavowed some of his own statements in that case later at the civil trial, which Simpson lost. He has said he is now repeatedly confronted with this stain on his career every time he is cross-examined as a so-called rented expert who basically sold his soul to Simpson for a $165,000 retainer. Now, understanding what a hit his reputation took in the legal world, it frankly explains how a normal man like Ben Brown, who had public defenders, could afford to hire someone as famous as Baden. And again, he is a paid expert, just like in those other high-profile cases I discussed, only more famous, who was testifying in disagreement with the medical professionals who actually treated Annie Shell. And also in this case, like the others, it was not the parent on trial. Dr. Baden, who reviewed Annie's autopsy report but did not examine her body, rejected the prosecution's allegation that Annie had died from being shaken. He testified that, in his opinion, Annie died from an infection resulting from an undiagnosed tear in her esophagus occurring the night before or that morning. He even went so far as to allege malpractice by the hospital, saying Annie had died from a fentanyl overdose. When one of her tubes was removed, fentanyl was used as a sedative to relieve the pain from her brain swelling. Dr. Baden also disputed that a firm conclusion could be drawn about the time of Annie's injuries without the blood clot removed from her brain being examined. He also questioned why, if Annie did die from being shaken, it was not mentioned anywhere in her autopsy report. In that study I told you about earlier, physicians and medical examiners pointed out that shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma were not as well understood in small towns or rural areas. It could be that Dr. Metcalf did not have extensive experience with SBS and left it off of the report, thinking that Annie's injuries spoke for themselves, along with her manner of death being ruled as homicide. In this age of confusion and controversy, experts like Dr. Baden will pick apart an autopsy report for details. After Baden's testimony, the defense showed a video of Annie climbing at the Shell home, claiming she fell from an open pantry which caused her injuries. To be clear, they showed her climbing, not falling. Then Benjamin Brown took the stand in his own defense, and he admitted to the court that on the morning in question he was at Brandy's house alone with the children. After Brandy had picked up Annie and Peyton, she dropped them off at home with him before heading to the hair salon. He testified that late in the morning, close to lunch, Annie told him her head hurt. He claimed that he told Annie that if she went to use the bathroom, he would give her a chewable Tylenol. When she was done, he said he put her pants on and got her a Tylenol from the bathroom closet. Then, according to Brown, he carried Annie into the living room. He testified that when he set the toddler down on her feet, she began seizing. Annie's legs buckled underneath her, and she fell to the floor. But instead of calling 911, Ben admitted that he called Brandy twice and then his father, claiming he didn't have Annie's information to give to 911, even despite his own dad telling him to call 911. As if you need the child's last name to summon an ambulance in an emergency. Brown then testified that he was concerned Annie would bite her tongue, so he put his thumb in the little girl's mouth, picking her up and laying her on the sofa. He said he tried putting cold water on Annie to revive her, but she began pulling her hair out. Around this time, Brandy arrived home and she called 911. Ben also testified that he did not see a mark on Annie's face until she was being examined by the paramedics who responded to the call. He insisted that he had not struck Annie and had no idea how she got the mark on her face. As expected, the prosecution tore Brown's testimony apart. He was accused of lying in court and in multiple statements. On cross-examination, the court heard that the actual reason he didn't call 911 was he didn't want anyone besides Brandy to find out he had been alone with Annie. I mean, can you imagine the audacity of his reason for not calling 911? As if a 911 operator would say, "I'm sorry, sir, but if you don't know the child's last name, we can't help you." Why was he not prepared to just tell the truth by his defense attorney? The lawyer had to know it would come out on cross. Brown also admitted to having lied to the police about Brandy being home that morning, saying Brandy told him to tell law enforcement she was home the whole time. After they lied, Brandy rode in the ambulance with Annie and Ben followed in a car behind, bringing Peyton to the hospital. You can see parts of his testimony on YouTube, and under this fiery cross-examination, as he is called a liar, you can see Benjamin Brown take a deep breath and several moments before answering, having to control his temper. It was not a good look, and a reason why defense attorneys often beg clients not to testify for themselves. After the state and defense rested, despite Brown's own admissions in court, it did not stop his attorney from moving for him to be acquitted on the basis that the case against him was entirely circumstantial. Judge Stillman denied the motion, given that Annie had not exhibited any symptoms until she was in Benjamin Brown's sole care, which he admitted on the stand. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On Valentine's Day, 2022, he was found guilty, but not on the original charges. In the state of Tennessee, when juries are determining an accused person's guilt, they can take lesser charges into account. And that's how Benjamin Brown came to be found guilty on the significantly lesser charges of criminally negligent homicide and reckless endangerment. The jury obviously did not come by this ruling easily. They deliberated for 11 hours over those 2 days. But it was crushing to Annie's parents, who desperately wanted justice for their little girl and had waited so long for their day in court. The Shells were understandably heartbroken by the verdict, and not just because the convicted killer would be free until sentencing. Even if Brown received the maximum penalty of just 2 years in prison, this essentially meant he could immediately be eligible for probation. The prosecutor explained that the Class E felony, even with the maximum sentence, only required 30% served, so Brown could be eligible for probation immediately. The family was now on desperate tenterhooks waiting for the judge's decision. But Judge Stillman was clearly surprised too, later saying at sentencing, "While I respect the jury's verdict, and the verdict is for negligent homicide, the court, having heard the evidence in the case, has difficulty reconciling that verdict with the facts that the court has heard. The jury made its decision, and I don't disrespect the decision, but with regard to what the court heard in the case, the facts were so much more egregious than just probably what most criminally negligent homicides are in the state. You might be thinking about the charge of involuntary manslaughter in other states. In Tennessee, involuntary manslaughter is divided into 3 categories: vehicular homicide, reckless homicide, and criminally negligent homicide. Obviously, this was not a case of vehicular homicide. So what is the difference between reckless and criminally negligent homicide? The main example I've seen given is that reckless homicide is like playing Russian roulette by picking up a gun with a single bullet in it and shooting it at a friend. You know there is substantial risk that the friend will die. In comparison, if you picked up a gun you believed was empty but failed to check before shooting it at your friend, that would be criminally negligent, because you should have looked to be sure it was empty before shooting. I think Russian roulette is either an oversimplified or an extreme example. It's hard to say. But obviously, this would be an extremely complicated and nuanced decision between the two. The other biggest thing between the two is reckless homicide is a Class D felony, whereas criminally negligent is a Class E. You can get a maximum of 12 years with Class D and 6 years with Class E. So for that 30% served, with a Class D felony, you might serve 4, but with a Class E, you would serve 2. Although this is a complicated choice for a jury, Tennessee has these different types of homicides so that there is not a, quote, one-size-fits-all solution in murder trials. Of course, if it is your child that has been murdered, you would hope that it would be a first-degree homicide conviction. If not, a second degree, which would still be significant time in prison. Second-degree murder in Tennessee is a Class A felony punishable by 15 to 60 years in prison. At this point in Annie's trial, all the Shells could do is hope that Judge Dillman would still sentence Brown for the maximum. That's better than probation, which would be nothing. The devastated Shells gave victim impact statements before sentencing. Tiffany said, "The loss of a child is a continuous loss that unfolds every day." She also told the court that in the 8 months after Annie died, she had stopped eating because she had given up on life. She had to be treated in a mental hospital after losing so much weight. Due to the anguish of losing Annie, Tiffany Shell was still suffering from ongoing depression and anxiety. She told Brown in court, "Every time I pass you, I get sick to my stomach. I thought for a long time, Ben, I thought you were innocent. But after seeing all this evidence, I have my own opinion of what happened. I've been told to forgive you, and I'm working on that. I do think that you deserve to spend time in jail." David Shell was more blunt and sounded much less conflicted about forgiveness when he told Brown, "I think you got away with it. 2 years is nowhere near enough. I miss my little girl. You don't deserve to have your kids." As I said before, Ben's ex-father-in-law, Claude Stamey, testified at the sentencing hearing, explicitly detailing Ben Brown's disturbing history of violence before he killed Annie. And let's be clear, it's not like he punched the older man in a mutual altercation. Ben went and attacked his father-in-law on his front porch, knocking Mr. Stamey down, beating him with a 15-pound metal statue, hitting him at least 10 times. And then he got a knife out of his vehicle before the police pulled up and intervened. And Ben Brown knew that his father-in-law was just days recovering from open-heart surgery. Mr. Stamey would die months later in November of 2022. But the spunky old guy said in court that day, "I begged my wife to please go get my gun and shoot this son of a bitch. He was out to do me in." Hearing all this, it's amazing Ben Brown was offered a plea of simple assault in that case. Brandishing a weapon, which I think a 15-pound metal statue would be, should have been considered aggravated assault. Not only would he have spent more time in jail, he would have had a felony on his record, which would have affected his sentencing in this trial and could have had an impact on the jury as well. Judge Stillman even pointed out that due to his familial relationship with Mr. Stamey, his actions that day constituted domestic assault, also much more serious than simple assault as he was offered in a plea deal. You know, we see on TV all the time how 90-something% of cases never even go to trial, and that's true for Tennessee as well. But can you imagine how different Benjamin Brown's trial might have been if he had been punished fairly for Mr. Stamey's assault? But at least you can't say that Judge Barry Stillman didn't take all of this into account, because he did, and he gave Brown the maximum. On April 27, 2022, Benjamin Brown was sentenced to 2 years for criminally negligent homicide, and for the reckless endangerment charge, he was sentenced to 11 months and 29 days in a workhouse. These sentences were to be served consecutively, and he was then taken into custody. The judge, when ruling, said, "The circumstances of the offense involve dishonesty. They lack empathy for a helpless child. The defendant shows an incredible amount of selfishness, not just misrepresenting the facts, but affirmatively hiding the facts from law enforcement." Then the judge said something that I had thought about immediately when I first read about Benjamin Brown. It is disturbing to the court that Brown would have such a lack of sympathy, especially since he has children. Ben Brown was a father himself. It's easy to forget that when you get submerged in Annie's case. Like I told you before, when David Shell was so incensed by Brown's low bond amount, when it is a stranger, when it comes to kids, we are picturing, in essence, a monster. This man was also a daddy to a baby girl, 2 daughters actually, which was probably why the judge was all the more disturbed by Brown's tone when he was describing what happened to Annie. Stillman said his tone was mocking and disrespectful when he was imitating the little girl. Benjamin Brown appealed his sentence by Judge Stillman because, as the Tennessee Supreme Court put it, his defense asserted that Stillman disagreed with the jury's verdict and took into consideration Brown's entire criminal history, even speeding tickets, when he sentenced him to the maximum on both charges. One of those tickets Brown got while he was out on bail before Annie's murder trial. He also admitted that he could not pass a drug test 2 weeks after her death. These more minor offenses are not always considered during sentencing, but the Tennessee Supreme Court agreed with Stillman that Benjamin Brown's criminal history in totality certainly warranted the maximum sentence. Considering the judge's comments, I'm not surprised about the nature of the appeal, even though most of us would think that Benjamin Brown got off light and should be thanking his lucky stars. But even though his defense attorneys called his verdict a big win, they were far from accepting the judge's ruling. Then I thought of the judge in the infamous nanny trial from 1997, reducing the charges and then sentencing her to time served. He spoke of a lack of malice, meaning legal malice, of course. And perhaps that is what this jury felt, that Benjamin Brown did not mean to kill Annie Shell. I said it myself earlier, that it's hard to believe he did mean to kill her, but it's harder to believe he didn't consciously hurt her. I think he meant to hurt her. There was intent there, maybe just not intent to kill. But the difference is really hard to swallow when it comes to the death of a child. When it was finally time for Brandi Giannunzio to go to trial, for various reasons, she went through 3 attorneys before things got down to brass tacks. In the end, after multiple hearings and much legal wrangling, Brandy pled guilty in February 2023 to making a false report. In return, the accessory charge was dropped. 6 months later, on August 22nd, the 31-year-old woman was given a suspended sentence of 4 years in prison, which means she will spend those 4 years on probation. The judge declined her request for judicial diversion, noting that Brandy was not just still in a relationship with Benjamin Brown, but she was now his fiancée. Though it should be noted that Brown was still not divorced from his first wife yet. Other key factors in Brandy's sentence were that she did not have custody of either her 12-year-old daughter with a former partner, nor the now 5-year-old daughter she had with Brown. Brandy's attorney asked Judge Stillman to recuse himself from the case, questioning his ability to be impartial given his previous comments at Ben's sentencing about the jury's decision to convict on lesser charges. Stillman declined. The Shells again made victim impact statements at Brandy's sentencing. Tiffany said, "My family and I have gone through hell the past 5 years. Brandy, I will never be able to forgive you." And then Tiffany looked at her and said something profound. She said, "I also pray that you will never have to endure the pain of losing a child." That is the kind of love parents have for their children, that they wouldn't wish that pain on any other person, even the one who had been responsible for their own child's death. Brandy took the stand at her sentencing, saying, "I take full responsibility for my actions. Not a day goes by that I don't think of or miss Annie." Brandy showed more remorse than her fiancé, and though she did not assault Annie, she was responsible for her safety that day, and she did in fact lie to the authorities, so probation still seems generous to me, though I don't think it would have been fair for her to serve as much or more time than Brown. Speaking of him, 4 months before Brandy was finally sentenced, on April 20th, 2003, Benjamin Brown was released on probation, just 7 days shy of a year in prison for killing a 3-year-old little girl. Today, he walks among us a free man, engaged to the woman who was supposed to be taking care of Annie that day. And at the end of it all, a shattered David and Tiffany Shell still understandably feel they won't ever get true justice for Annie. On August 21st, 2019, a year after Annie passed away, her family stood on the banks of Chickamauga Lake at Chester Frost Park and released floating lanterns on the water. This was as they were still awaiting court dates, before the world stood still for the pandemic. The family has honored Annie in any way they can ever since, quietly celebrating each birthday, which comes so close on the heels of that other painful milestone, the day they lost her. At Annie's grave, there is a small mailbox where Tiffany Shell leaves letters of things she said she never got to tell Annie. Watching interviews of David and Tiffany Shell, I am in awe of their strength. They waited so long for justice, only to have the jury choose the lightest charges. It really is the unthinkable. Annie would have been 9 years old this August, in the 3rd grade, maybe still doing gymnastics, or maybe the girly girl who loved pink would be in a kids' club for cheerleading or dance classes. Or maybe she would have loved to climb trees and discovered she was a great ball player. Maybe she would have loved reading or drawing or painting. There are too many heartbreaking maybes when a child dies, especially when it is a violent death. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by me and Gemma Harris. As usual, any editorial comments and opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Schexnayder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and click on the listener suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages, but please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe, and please tell a friend or rate and review. I'm on all large platforms like iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, and YouTube. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.